Kate Grantham is an international development researcher and consultant specializing in women's rights and gender equality issues ranging from education and decent employment to health and gender-based violence to social norms and care work. Kate is founder and principal consultant of FemDev, an international development consulting firm passionate about feminist approaches to research, evaluation, and analysis. Recent clients include Oxfam Canada, Malala Fund, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Kate is a PhD in women's studies and feminist research from Western University. So we're proud to have an alumni come back and speak with us here today. And she's also president of the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. So thank you so much, Kate, for joining us here today. I think what we've planned is about a talk for about half an hour, and then after that we'll open up the floor to questions and discussions if people want to stick around and join in that discussion. So thanks so much, Kate, and I will pass the floor over to you.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction and the invitation to speak today. I'm truly so happy to be online with you all today and to share my experience and some of my insights about building a quote unquote non-academic career in the field of international development. Not as a last resort or as a fallback option, but as a deliberate path that I've chosen with intention and with purpose. And I put the term non-academic in quotations because much of the work I do is actually academic work in the sense of producing research, scholarship, teaching. I just don't work in a university setting. And so, one of my messages for today is that this line between academic and non-academic work may actually be much less clear-cut than we imagine it to be. So I think that this type of conversation and this speaker series writ large is really important for graduate students especially, and that's for a number of reasons. First, I have found in my experience that there tends to be fewer role models within the university or within university departments who have worked outside of academia. So awareness of the possibilities for non-academic careers is naturally going to be quite limited. The more that graduate students have a chance to interact with folks who are doing things in the world that aren't the standard things you might imagine PhDs doing, the better that they can imagine the full range of possibilities for their own careers. And PhDs programs in most disciplines and graduate programs, masters as well, have traditionally focused on preparing students for academic careers. But many of us know that only a minority of current graduates actually obtain academic positions. So the tenure track field in Canada is more narrow and more competitive than ever before, due both to a shrinking number of jobs, but also a growing reliance by universities on contract faculty. So in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on my career outside of academia so far. I'm only a few years out of my PhD, but what it looks like, how I got here, and a few of the strategies that I've developed along the way around things like knowledge translation, community building, and self-advocacy. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about my work. So in my bio, I mentioned that I'm an international development researcher and consultant. But what even is a consultant? This is one of those jobs that people say that they have and you hear it, but you kind of wonder what it actually means. It's still a bit of a black box, and I think it depends on the sector that you work in. But in my case, I'm effectively a contract researcher. I think that's the best way to describe it. I work with clients in the international development sector to promote women's rights and gender equality. That's mostly NGOs like Oxfam Canada and Malala Fund, for example, that were mentioned earlier, but also governments, research institutes, multilateral organizations at the UN, and donors as well, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I work with them to provide the following types of services. So I do things like designing, facilitating, and analyzing research. So just to give you an example, right now I'm working with two organizations to research global responses to the COVID exacerbated childcare crisis. So we're doing interviews with experts, we're doing virtual consultations with organizations working in this space. We're doing a survey, we're doing all of this work to understand what have been some of the most promising and innovative solutions to addressing the childcare crisis globally. That's just research, right? It is a specific contract that I'm working on, but that is just designing, facilitating, and analyzing research. I also work with organizations to evaluate their international development programs, whether helping them to understand, the baseline of where a community is at prior to implementing a program, helping them understand, a process evaluation to know if their program is working efficiently, or an impact evaluation to understand the actual impacts of their intervention within a society or a community or an organization. So this includes the design of data collection instruments, the design of specific indicators, which is actually one of the most interesting and challenging parts of my work. Like, imagine if you are, as I have been in many cases, trying to understand the impact of a program on women's economic empowerment. What are you even actually measuring? Are you measuring the number of women who have jobs? That doesn't tell you much about the quality of their jobs necessarily. So, if their jobs are highly exploitative, they're low paid, they're contract work, they work in dangerous settings, is really measuring the number of women who have jobs a robust indicator for measuring their empowerment? I would argue no. So then what do you measure instead, right? So these are the types of questions that I would have to be considering when I'm working on a program evaluation. I do, kind of standard literature reviews and evidence reviews on women's rights and gender equality issues. I've done landscaping analysis of development programs, policies, and trends. And basically what that means, and actually I'm hired to do this quite a bit, and I really never knew what this term landscaping analysis meant before I was doing this work, but it's different than a literature review or an evidence review. It actually asks you to understand the landscape of a specific issue. So for example, I worked with an organization to help understand, who was doing work on women's economic empowerment. Again, they were about to commit, millions of dollars to doing a program on women's economic empowerment. They wanted to know who else is doing work on this issue. Where are they working? What have the findings been from the work that they've done? Who could we maybe partner with in different regions to when we want to launch our program? Basically, what do we need to know in order to do this program well? Give us a sense of the landscape of who else is doing this work. And that's, just, one example of what a landscaping analysis can be. I also work with organizations to help them translate technical data and evidence into what I call alternative knowledge products. So this means helping them translate, data that they've collected from a project or from a community or on an issue into a format that is actually ready to be read and put to use by audiences. So, instead of having an Excel sheet with thousands of data points, they want to actually analyze and write about what that actually means in context. So are we writing an academic paper? Are we producing a 2 to 3 page policy brief that just looks at policy implications? Are we producing an op-ed to try and influence public opinion on an issue? Are we delivering a workshop about the findings to a specific group of colleagues or stakeholders? So I work with organizations to help them translate some of their data and evidence into these alternative knowledge products. It's what's called knowledge translation. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation in the context of being a skill that I really think strongly that graduate students should have if they want to work in either academic or non-academic careers, knowledge translation. Also project and funding proposal development. So for example, I recently worked with Islamic Relief Canada, it's an NGO here in Canada, to help them produce a project and a funding proposal for Global Affairs Canada. I forget how much money it was, but it was a couple $1 million to deliver a project that was providing women and girls in conflict affected settings in Iraq with access to water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure and services. So thinking through, what would that project involve? How much money would we need to pull it off? How would we be evaluating the impact of that project? It's a huge undertaking. And so sometimes organizations hire me to help them think through that process and put it all together as a funding proposal to a donor. But enough about my work right now. I just want to take a step back and maybe chat a little bit about my career path so far. And one of the things that I think is really interesting as I reflect back myself is that many of the positions I've held since completing my PhD, I didn't even really know that they existed, which is kind of funny. So I just want to chat a little bit about the path that I've taken to my current career. So I had the great fortune. Well, I'll start off by saying I did my master's and my PhD in the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research at Western. It was a really, really positive experience. And one of the true fortunes I had during my PhD in particular was that I had the opportunity to teach while I was finishing my PhD at Huron College's Center for Global Studies. It was a really fantastic department. My colleagues there were exceptionally supportive. They, unlike some university departments, made sure that when they hired me, it wasn't just for one course, it was for 3 courses, so that I was always making a decent living. I was teaching courses more than once, so I wasn't always having to learn new material, put together new syllabi, teach new courses. They were just really tuned into what it's like to be a contract faculty member, and they were doing their best to support me and to mitigate some of those negative impacts. And I actually really loved teaching in some respects. I loved working with students. I found it to be a really creative process, but I also learned that it just wasn't the right career path for me. You know, I had a lot of performance anxiety before and after lectures. I was really hard on myself afterwards. I found it to be quite emotionally exhausting. And teaching is also the type of work where there's always something more that you could be doing. And for my personality type, I found it to be really challenging to maintain a healthy work-life balance, keeping that in mind. Also, the really highly competitive and somewhat exploitative nature of contract teaching was something that I both really resented, despite the efforts of my colleagues at Huron to mitigate that. And it was also just something I didn't want to participate in long term. So I just want to state at the outset that it's not that I was ever, pushed out of academia per se. I just wanted something different. And so I chose to pursue that career path deliberately. And I set out to find work that actually allowed me to use the skills that I developed as a graduate student and put them to use in a non-academic setting. So skills like critical thinking, project management, budgeting, communicating complex ideas to diverse audiences, these are all really highly transferable skills. And so as a postdoc at the University of Ottawa and later as a research associate at McGill University, I got to experience working with one foot in and one foot out of academia. So in both of those cases, I was working as a researcher based within a university institution, but I was working with a civil society partner on a specific research initiative. And so this was where I really saw my ability to apply existing skill sets that I had to non-academic work. And I didn't see why I had to be based out of a university in order to keep doing it. And so I'm just going to kind of pause for a moment and just mention, in case anyone's never heard of the position of research associate before, because it's a position that I had not heard of before I applied for it. I read about it and I thought, hey, this is amazing. It's basically a position where you're working within a university department. In my case, it was the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University, but you're there purely as a researcher, it's not a teaching position. And so I just mention this, I note this explicitly because there are lots of opportunities to work within a university that don't necessarily require you to teach, or maybe allow you to teach as a really small part of the work that you do. And so if you're thinking about not necessarily wanting to teach or to teach full time, but not wanting to leave the university setting, I would encourage you to think about the other types of positions, or to take a moment and learn about the other types of positions that you could have within the university context that don't look like some of the more traditional positions that maybe we've seen modeled for us in our graduate studies career. So that's just something to keep in mind. So as I was working as a research associate, I was working for both McGill and the International Development Research Center here in Ottawa on a partnership initiative. Um, I realized that it was really cool to be working with an organization that was doing applied work. It was research work, but they were also funding programming on the ground in countries all around the world, supporting women's economic empowerment. And I just really enjoyed the kind of application, the practical application of all of these skills that I had been developing along the way. And it was my first kind of taste at consulting, because although I wasn't formally a consultant, I was working on a contract basis to carry out this research initiative. And so I decided that this is actually something I wanted to do, full time if I could possibly get away with it. So in January of this year, I left my position at McGill and I decided to launch my own consulting firm, FemDev. And I continue to work with partners in the international development sector on specific research, analysis, or evaluation initiatives. And it's really work, honestly, that I love. It's the best job I've ever had. It's incredibly project oriented. So I get to, work within an organization, get to meet all the amazing people that are on their staff, that are part of their teams, carry out a specific research project or evaluation with them. And then I'm done with it. I kind of get to just, move on. And there's something really satisfying about that. I think for a lot of jobs, you're constantly working on similar things, or you're seeing through the life of something to the end. Like these projects that I'm helping organizations to design, for instance, I don't then work with them for the next 4, 5, 6 years to see those projects through. I move on to something else. And while that might not necessarily be, how everyone likes to work, I do find the project-oriented contract nature of it really, really satisfying. I'm able to kind of close the book on one thing as I move on to the next. It's also really independent work. I work with often multiple clients simultaneously. Sometimes we have regular meetings, sometimes we don't. My schedule is really flexible. It's really my own. I can decide when I want to take on additional work. If I have something coming up in my life that's really big, and I know that I'm not going to have as much time to take a little bit of time off when I need to. It's just really flexible and really independent. Now, of course, it can be quite scary sometimes to work contract to contract. Sometimes I'll think I really would like to take a break, so I don't accept any contracts for the next month or something. And then, I'm 2 days into that month and I'm worried about how I'm going to act, or if I'll ever get a contract again. It's, it's not for the faint of heart. Sometimes give myself a lot of anxiety, but it's worked out so far. I've also really benefited from the relationships that I cultivated as a postdoc, as a research associate, as a PhD student, in terms of helping me to find clients and get contracts. But there are other strategies that I've learned along the way that have helped me find some success in my career. So the first one I want to talk about is knowledge translation. And so knowledge translation, I have the definition here. It's the range of activities involved in communicating research and evidence for uptake and use by decision makers. So, the goal of research is not for research's sake. At least in my case, the goal of research is to influence quote unquote end users. So people who actually set policies, people who actually deliver programs, to influence them in order to advance social justice, right? That's the goal here. And I've learned really quickly, I think, working outside of the university, that research producers and research end users, these policymakers, these program developers, they often speak different languages and they have really different information seeking habits. And a really good example of this is publishing in academic journals. As graduate students, and maybe this is changing, but when I was a graduate student, 99% of what was assigned to me on a course syllabus was academic journals. When I was trained to write my own papers for courses, I was told to use the library catalog to identify other academic journals that supported the argument that I was making, or that's where I was finding information and getting evidence. However, that's not how the rest of the world accesses information for the most part. Governments, for example, if you're trying to influence government policy on an issue, then publishing in an academic journal isn't necessarily your most effective strategy. First and foremost, academic journals sit behind copyright paywalls, and governments don't have access to them. They don't have a library catalog where they go, and look up their own academic journals. They're just not reading them. And even if they did have access, even if they could get behind that paywall, they're time-pressed public servants. They're not going to read a 25-page, 30-page paper on a topic. I've learned this the hard way. They're looking for really brief and accessible information that gets to the policy implications of that research. So that's just one example, but also the way that we're trained by academics as academics to write. It can sometimes be long-winded. It can be quite theoretical. This is all just standard practice in academia. And if you're writing for other academics and other researchers, then it makes sense to do it that way. But if you're trying to influence end users, people who will actually take up your research and put it into use, then it's worth thinking about how those individuals get their information and how you need to package it in order to be most useful for them. So I'll just give you an example. Earlier this year, I published a paper in the journal World Development on the challenges of measuring women's economic empowerment. Now, this paper, I think we wrote it honestly 3 years ago. It took forever to get through the peer review process. This is another challenge with publishing in academic journals. End users are looking for timely evidence and data. And this, we did this work, 3 years ago by the time it was published. But it was really well received by the academic community and my colleagues at other universities. I published this with some of my colleagues at McGill. But we knew that it was going to take a long time to get published. And we knew that the research was so important that we needed to get it to individuals working in NGOs, to researchers working at other institutions faster. So we also published it as what's known as a working paper. And working papers are pre-publication versions of academic papers, so of journal articles, for instance. And there are tons of working paper series that exist at different institutions in international development. There are working paper series, but I imagine in other sectors, there are working paper series as well, or places where you can publish papers before they've been peer reviewed, before they've been, or in this case, it was an expedited peer review process in the working paper series that we went through. But before they've gone through that, whole publishing process, you can publish them and they're open access. So they don't sit behind paywalls. You just share a URL link and anyone in the world can access it. This also makes it more accessible, which in international development is really important, to our colleagues and our partners working in institutions in low and middle income settings who don't necessarily have access, again, to journal catalogs or have the ability to pay for things that sit behind paywalls. But beyond that, we still knew that if we were trying to influence the government of Canada to think through how they're actually measuring women's economic empowerment in their international development programming, and right now the government of Canada has a feminist international assistance policy, meaning they're really, really focused on gender equality and women's empowerment issues. We wanted to help them think through how they're actually measuring if their programs and policies have been successful in that respect. We knew they're not going to read this 25-page paper, even if it was available to them open access. So we also produced what's called a policy brief, which in this case was, I think, 2 to 3 pages, a 2 to 3 page brief that focuses specifically on the policy implications of the research. Now, in some academic papers, we have entire, multi-page sections on research methods. But our government partners who have, talked to us about this policy brief, but other policy briefs that I've done, have noted that they don't even need a paragraph on methods, maybe a sentence on methods. So you think about the type of information we're so used to putting in publications that we write for other academic audiences. There's just different standards of practice and formats that make it easier for other types of end users to actually digest, and put to use the research that we're publishing. So this is just one example of a knowledge translation strategy for a specific research project that I was working on. So really the key thing here is to understand who your audience is and to meet them where they're at. So if you want to be influencing or supporting the work of community-based organizations, it also makes sense to write a report or produce a short video or a series of infographics rather than an academic journal. Think about where they have access to information and their information seeking habits, and then gear your own research and communication strategy to them. This is just not something that I was trained to do in the context of my graduate degree. And it's a skill that I've learned is incredibly important for making sure that the research I produce gets the most uptake and is put to the best use possible. Another strategy that I found really important is around community building. And this is really all about finding your people. So in my graduate degree, in my PhD especially, I was so lucky to have a really supportive supervisor and to have a group of girlfriends who were all going through our PhDs together. And we were just really supportive of one another. We would, get together to watch Veronica Mars, maybe talk about our work, maybe not. One of them is actually here today supporting me right now. And just, the people that build you up, the people that you can talk to, that support you, that help elevate your work, that push you to be more, in my case, more feminist, more progressive, more thoughtful about the work that I'm doing. Find those people, maybe they're colleagues, maybe they're mentors, and hold on to them and support them right back. This is huge. These are the types of people who are going to help you, be a better version of yourself and produce better work. They're also the types of people who might help you land the position that really fits with your values and the impact you want to have. These are the people that know you best. So find those people. But also, think about ways that you can leverage the institution that you're in. So maybe your department, maybe your university, your research, your professional networks, your peers, to help amplify your work and reciprocate. So maybe that means if you just published a paper or a report, sending it through a listserv in your department, asking people to spread the word to other folks who might be interested in this research, asking your colleagues to put it up on their Twitter, throwing it up to people's LinkedIn. I know there was a session on the value of LinkedIn for building a career earlier on in this series. I have definitely gotten jobs through LinkedIn. It's the weirdest thing. I used to think, this was just a space where like my dad would go, to network with people. But actually, this is where a lot of employers are recruiting and selecting individuals, and where a lot of organizations are actually looking for information and research. So, leverage the groups that you're a part of to help you amplify your work, and then reciprocate. Do the same for them. Be a part of their community building. Be a part of their success as well. A third strategy is to just, ask to meet with individuals who have the job that you want, right? If you see someone and they've got a job, ask them how they got it. Ask them what their career path was like. But always come prepared with questions. Don't just, show up to a call and say like, so tell me about your career. Actually have specific questions that you want to ask them. Have thoughtful questions that you want to ask them. Always keep time. So never keep them longer than you've asked. I would say ask for no more than half an hour of their time for a meeting. Always express thanks, both on the call and afterwards, and follow up. People love to hear if their advice helped you to think through a problem or get a job. Follow up with them, either immediately afterwards, but also maybe a bit in the medium or longer term, just to let them know that you appreciated their help. It will go a really, really long way in both, letting them know, like acknowledging and being grateful for their time, but also maintaining that relationship for a longer period, right? Just be thoughtful, be courteous, always follow up. And the third, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, is self-advocacy. And this to me is about recognizing your value and your values. So when I think about all the jobs that I've had that led to this place, I don't think I always felt as though my value was being recognized. Sometimes I just wasn't treated with as much seriousness as I would have liked to have been, or my ideas were dismissed, or, you know, I, I just, when I look back and I think about the jobs that made me the happiest, it's where I felt like my value was being recognized. So be aware of your value, and also be aware of your values. So think about what it is that you actually want out of a career. Sometimes I speak with students, either through workshops that I put on with PhD students on knowledge translation. I do a whole workshop on that topic, or just because I still have friends who are, you know, in their PhD. And I think that a lot of them intend to become a professor because it's kind of it's seen as the natural next step. It's the only kind of career progression that they've been led to believe is worthwhile or natural coming out of a PhD. But actually think about what it is you really want. Don't just, try to get a tenure job because you think it's what you're supposed to do. Is it that actually the type of career you want? And for me, I really have learned I value my independence, my flexibility, my work-life balance, being able to speak my mind. There are some institutions where you work with, your Twitter account is not your own. You cannot just say whatever you want and criticize the government and, speak up about social issues. So think about the type of institution you want to work for. For me, I also really value working with feminist organizations that promote, intersectional and transformative gender equality work, right? I want to work with those groups. And, thinking through your value and your values and then aligning those with the type of work that you're doing, I think is a really important form of self-advocacy. And as someone who works, for myself, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about. But also establish a public and a professional presence beyond the university. Don't just attend academic conferences to share your research. Right now, one of the silver linings of COVID is that all of these different organizations in civil society or in government, they're all putting on online events right now. You have the ability to be in these spaces where, before distance, travel costs would have been a real barrier. Those don't exist in the same way. So start to put yourself in spaces that are outside of the traditional academic spaces. And that's both in terms of, being there yourself, but also putting your research out there. I would also suggest establishing some kind of a social media profile. If you want to get a position outside of an academic space, a place where you're going to be, seeking jobs and applying for work regularly, I think it's been really helpful both for generating a network and a support group and for attracting potential employers to have a public personality out there on Twitter. It's really clear. I use Twitter. You can use whatever you want though. If you come to my social media, what my values are, the work I do, the fact that, I'm a feminist killjoy is right there in front of you. And I think that that's actually opened more doors than it's closed. So I would encourage, get yourself into spaces beyond the university and be really genuine. Like will attract like. I've definitely had a really good conversation with a group of graduate students earlier this week in a class I was guest lecturing in, a really thoughtful conversation about, the potential pitfalls of explicitly labeling your work as feminist, because you may alienate some colleagues or institutions or employers. And it made me realize that, for all the people that I've alienated by being kind of myself and in their face about my values, I've attracted far more. And I'm much more interested in the people who build me up and support me and push me to be even more progressive than whoever those jerks were who wrote me off because, I used the word feminist to describe my work. So just, I guess, be genuine and it will pay out. So my key takeaways for today is that pursuing a non-academic career does not make you a failure. And I really hate that I have to say this, but I know that this is some of the type of messaging that some graduate students are receiving through the course of their careers, but it absolutely does not. It's a choice that you can make deliberately because it's the more exciting choice, the more fulfilling choice. It's a choice that's equally as legitimate as pursuing an academic career. And again, the line between academic and non-academic is not always so clear cut. I would describe much of the work that I do as, rigorous academic work. I'm not based at a university. There are endless options to apply the skills that you're cultivating to careers within or beyond the university. Truly, like there are so many things that you could do with the degree you're getting now. Maybe that not have nothing even to do with the degree that you got, but the skills that you're learning, like I said, critical thinking, project management, communication, budgeting, research, these are all highly transferable skills. So don't limit yourself unnecessarily and be your own cheerleader. This gets back to self-advocacy, right? You are the one who gets to decide what you want to do with your life and with your career. So put your work out there into the spaces that you think reflect your values. Meet up with the people and support the people who support you. Be your own cheerleader, I think, is advice I try to give myself all of the time. So those are my key takeaways. I would be really, really interested at this point in the presentation to hear people's reactions, experiences. Maybe you've had some of the same experiences I did in my graduate studies, but also questions if you have any for